The answer to the question of who this being actually is, Dasein, seems to have already been given with the formal indication of the basic characteristics of Dasein, cf. Section 9. Dasein is a being which I myself am. Its being is in each case mine. This determination indicates an ontological constitution, but no more than that. At the same time, it contains an ontic indication, albeit an undifferentiated one, that an I is always this being and not others. The who is answered in terms of the I itself, the subject, the self. The who is what maintains itself as an identity throughout changes in behavior and experiences, and in this way relates itself to this multiplicity. Ontologically, we understand it as what is always already and constantly present in a closed region, and for that region, as that which lies at its basis in an eminent sense, as the subject to it. As something self-same in manifold otherness, this subject has the character of the self. Even if one rejects a substantial soul, the thingliness of consciousness, and the objectivity of the person, ontologically one still posits something whose being sane retains the meaning of objective presence, whether explicitly or not. Substantiality is the ontological clue for the determination of beings, in terms of which the question of the who is answered. Dasein is tacitly conceived in advance as objective present. In any case, the indeterminacy of its being always implies this meaning of being. However, objective presence is the mode of beings unlike Dasein. The ontic obviousness of the statement that it is I who is in each case Dasein must not mislead us into supposing that the way for an ontological interpretation of what is thus given has been unmistakably prescribed. It is even questionable whether the ontic content of the above statement reaches the phenomenal content of everyday Dasein. It could be the case that the who of everyday Dasein is precisely not I myself. In coming to ontic and ontological statements, our phenomenal demonstration in terms of the mode of beings is to retain priority over the most obvious and usual answers as well as the problems arising from these. Then the phenomenological interpretation of Dasein must be protected from a perversion Verkehrung of its problematic with regard to the question to be raised now. But does it not go against the rules of a sound method when the approach to a problematic does not stick to the givens that are evident within the thematic realm? And what is less dubious than the givenness of the I? And for the purpose of working this givenness out in a primordial way, does it not direct us to abstract from everything else that is given, not only from an existing world, but also from the being of other is? Perhaps what this kind of giving gives this simple, formal, reflective perception of the I is indeed evident. This insight even opens access to an independent phenomenological problematic, which has its fundamental significance in the framework known as formal phenomenology of consciousness. In the present context of an existential analytic of factical Dasein, the question arises whether the way of the giving of the I which we mentioned discloses Dasein in its everydayness, if it discloses it at all. Is it then a priori self-evident that the access to Dasein must be simple perceiving reflection of the I of acts? What if this kind of self-giving of Dasein were to lead our existential analytic astray, and do so in a way grounded in the being of Dasein itself? Perhaps when Dasein addresses itself in the way which is nearest to itself, it always says it is I, and finally says this most loudly when it is not this being. What if the fact that Dasein is so constituted that it is in each case mine, were the reason for the fact that Dasein is, initially and for the most part, not itself? What if, with the approach mentioned above, the existential analytic fell into the trap, so to speak, of starting with the givenness of the I for Dasein itself and its obvious self-interpretation? What if it should turn out that the ontological horizon for the determination of what is accessible in simple giving should remain fundamentally undetermined? We can probably always correctly say ontically of this being that I am it. However, the ontological analytic which makes use of such statements must have fundamental reservations about them. The I must be understood only in the sense of a non-committal formal indication of something which perhaps reveals itself in the actual phenomenal context of being as that being's opposite. Then not I by no means signifies something like a being which is essentially lacking I-hood, but means a definite mode of being of the I itself. For example, having lost but even the positive interpretation of Dasein that has been given up to now already forbids a point of departure from the formal givenness of the I if the intention is to find a phenomenally adequate answer to the question of the who. The clarification of being in Thewworld showed that a mere subject without a world is not initially and is also never given. And thus, an isolated I without the others is in the end just as far from being given initially. But if the others are always already there with us in being in the world, ascertaining this phenomenally too, must not mislead us into thinking that the ontological structure of what is thus given is self-evident and not in need of an investigation. The task is to make this Dasein with Mitsein of the nearest everydayness phenomenally visible, and to interpret it in an ontologically appropriate way. Just as the ontic, self-evident character of the being in itself of inner-worldly beings misleads us to the conviction of the ontologically self-evident character of the meaning of this being sane, and makes us overlook the phenomenon of world, so too does the ontically self-evident character that Dasein is always my own harbor the possibility that the ontological problematic inherent in it might be led astray. Initially, the who of Dasein is not only a problem ontologically, it also remains concealed ontically. But then is the existential analytical answer to the question of the who without any clues at all. By no means. Be sure of the formal indications of the constitution of being of Dasein given above, section 9 and 12. It is not so much the ones which we discussed thus far which function as such a clue, but rather the one according to which the essence of Dasein is grounded in its existence. If the one is an essential determination of Dasein, then it must be interpreted existentially. The question of the who can then be answered only by a phenomenal demonstration of a definite kind of being of Dasein. If Dasein is always only itself in existing, the constancy of the self as well as its possible inconstancy require an existential ontological kind of questioning as the only adequate access to the problematic. But if the self is conceived only as a way of the being of this being, then that seems tantamount to volatilizing the authentic core of Dasein. But such fears are nourished by the distorted presumption that the being in question really has, at bottom, the kind of being of something objectively present, even if one avoids attributing to it the solidifying element of a corporeal thing. However, the substance of human being is not spirit as the synthesis of body and soul, it is rather existence.